Hello, this is Lawrence Holgate, and this is episode 9 of John Locke's second Treatise of Government. I'm reading out of my book called Understanding John Locke, which you can pick up at Amazon.com if you want to follow along as I read through it and discuss it at the same time. We've been talking about property. In episode 8, we introduced the topic. Locke is very firm about his idea of private property and how important it is to the escape from nature, the state of nature. He has two arguments for private property in the state of nature. One called the labor argument, which we discussed in episode 8. And now in episode 9, we're going to turn to the incorporation argument. If you're following along in my book, that would be chapter 5 at section 5.2.2, titled The Incorporation Argument. This is a less famous argument justifying private ownership, and it's called the incorporation argument after the verb to incorporate, which simply means to take into one's body. Let's see how that goes. Here is a quote, a rather long quote. I'll read it slowly, from paragraph 28 of Second Treatise. He that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathered from the trees in the wood, has certainly appropriated them to himself. Nobody can deny but the nourishment is his. I ask then, when did they begin to be his? When he digested? Or when he eats, or when he boiled, or when he brought them home, or when he picked them up? And it is plain, if the first gathering made them not his, nothing else could. That's paragraph 28. Now, the incorporation argument is deceptively short. The argument goes something like this. If picking apples from the tree does not make them mine, that is, my property, then nothing else could make them mine. That would be, we'll state that as premise 1. Premise 2. Nobody can deny that the nourishment I get from eating and digesting the apples is mine. That is, it is my nourishment, it's not yours. Therefore, picking the apples from the tree makes them mine. It's a simple argument, 3 steps. Locke is relying on an application of the valid argument form called modus-tollens. If a conditional statement, like if P then Q, is accepted, and the consequent of that statement is denied, that is, not Q, then the negation of the antecedent can be inferred. In this case, it would be not P. So here's the form of the argument. If picking the apples does not make them mine, then it is not the case that something else can make them mine. But something else can make them mine. For example, digesting the apples would certainly make them mine. Therefore, it is not the case that picking the apples does not make them mine. That is, picking the apples does make them mine. Locke makes a long list of acts of labor that I might perform prior to being nourished by the acorns and apples. For example, picking them from the tree or picking them off the ground, bringing them home, preparing them to eat, eating and digesting. The preceding arguments is just as compelling if we use the word digesting in the first 2 premises. Thus, if we agree that Locke, that once digested, then the apples are certainly mine, then we have also agreed that there is at least one act, namely digesting, that makes them mine. This admission supposedly negates the consequent of premise 1. Remember that the consequent of premise number 1 was nothing else could make them mine. And Locke believes that simple logic forces us to conclude that the very first act of picking up the acorns from the ground or the apples from the tree makes them my property. Now, there have been some serious criticisms of the incorporation argument, most notably that it commits what we call the fallacy of ambiguity. This fallacy is committed when a key word or term is used in 2 different senses, or two different meanings in a premise and in the conclusion. And an argument is valid only if identical words have the same meaning in both premises and conclusion. In Locke's Incorporation Argument, this rule is violated. The word mine has a different meaning in the second premise than it has in both the first premise and in the conclusion. In the second premise, the word mine means in my body, meaning that the digested apple has been incorporated into my body via the digestive process. Once digested, no one can get the apple back. It's gone. It's been digested. But that is not the meaning of the word mine in premise 1 and in the conclusion. Instead, the word mine in those two places means my property. That's a big difference. Being mine means my property in the conclusion, but when he talks in premise 2 about being mine, he means you can't get it back, it's in my stomach. So Locke's argument has the following invalid form. If picking the apples does not make them my property, then it is not the case that something else can make them my property. Premise 2, something else does make them part of my body, for example, digesting the apples. Conclusion, therefore picking the apples does make them my property. That's simply invalid because of the fallacy of ambiguity. Think about that. If you kind of got lost while I was reading, pick up the book if you can. It's pretty cheap at Amazon.com, and you can follow along. So we're going to move on now to 5.3 of Chapter 5, and this is called the Spoilage Provision in the discussion of property. Now, it was already remarked that Locke puts moral limits on attempts to use one's labor to gain private ownership of things taken from the commons. The limits are to the amount and quality of the things that one leaves in the common. A man must leave enough and as good for others to take, Locke says. He can't take the last remaining apple, or take a lot of apples but leave only bad apples. Locke adds to these limits a third provision. One cannot take things from the commons and then destroy them, or leave them to spoil. Locke writes that God has given us things to enjoy. Here's the quote, paragraph 31. As much as anyone can make use of to any advantage of life before it spoils, so much he may by his labor fix a property in. Whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. Nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy. End quote. Well, this leaves us asking a question. Why can't I remove something from the commons and destroy it or let it spoil? Locke's answer is that this would be taking, quote, more than my share, and it belongs to others. My share is determined by what I can make use of to any advantage of life before it spoils, but that's it. A version of the spoilage argument would look like this. This is, if you're following along in the paperback version of the book, this is at page 71. We're still in section 5.3. So here's the spoilage argument, a version of it at least. Premise 1, it is always wrong to take more than my share. Premise 2, I take more than my share whenever I knowingly take a thing from the commons that will probably spoil while in my possession. Therefore, this is step 3, it is always wrong to knowingly take a thing that will probably spoil while in my possession. Now, this argument applies only to those situations in which there is a scarcity of the thing in question. For example, apples or plums, which tend to rot within a relatively short time after being picked from the tree. But suppose there is no scarcity, because there is much more than enough to satisfy the appetites of everyone in the natural community. In that case, we have no standard for my share, and the argument collapses. In a community in which there is no standard for determining what is or is not my share of a spoilable thing, we can't conclude that it is wrong to knowingly take a thing that will probably spoil in my possession. Well, there's two ways to avoid spoilage. We're now at section 5.4, chapter 5, 5.4, with the title Bartering Plums for Nuts and Pebbles. Two ways to avoid spoilage. Either use the apples and the plums that one accumulates before they spoil, or barter away the apples and plums. Bartering. He says we can barter away those that would have rotted in a week for nuts that would last good for eating a whole year. Suppose that I come up to you, you have a lot of peanuts, and I have a lot of plums. My plums are going to rot in a week, so I trade them to you for nuts, the peanuts that you have that would last good for eating a whole year. Again, a quote from Locke, paragraph 46 of Second Treatise. Again, he would give his nuts for a piece of metal, pleased with its color, or exchange his sheep for shells, or wool for a sparkling pebble or a diamond, and keep those by him all his life. He invaded not the rights of others. He might heap up as much of these durable things as he pleased. The exceeding the bounds of his just property, not lying in the largeness of his possession, but the perishing of anything uselessly in it. So your just property, the property that you own, that you can call just, or just ownership, that doesn't apply to the largeness of what you possess, how much you've got, but the perishing of anything while you've got it. It's in that last sentence that Locke finally tells us why we ought not to use our labor to accumulate too many vegetables and fruits, thereby allowing the overage to rot and spoil. And the reason is that this act of omission, he says, invades the rights of others. How so? What right of yours do I invade by letting my uneaten plums, apples, and cabbages spoil? How do I harm you? Well, as described in the text that we just read, suppose that everyone in my natural community has grown a bumper crop of plums, and everyone has more than enough for themselves and their family. Surely no one is harmed by the failure of some persons to let a few of their plums spoil because they were unable to consume or barter away all their crop. Perhaps Locke means only that those who allow their perishable goods to spoil will harm others in times of need, when there is not enough to sustain health or life. In that case, any harm done to others would be explained by a failure to observe a natural duty of equality, for example, to love others as much as we love ourselves, or just by being charitable. Think back on the quotation from paragraph 2.2 by Richard Hooker, and you'll see what Locke is talking about. So let's turn now to private ownership of land. We haven't talked about that. Locke hasn't talked about that. I'm reading from section 5.5 of chapter 5. In paragraph 32 of Second Treatise, Locke turns from his consideration of property in the fruits of the earth and the beasts that subsist on it to, quote, the chief matter of how property in the earth itself is to be acquired. How do I get land, in other words? His first position on this matter is that property in land is acquired in much the same way as property in apples, pears, pigs, and horses. Quote, as much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, that much is his property. He, by his labor, does, as it were, enclose it from the common. End quote. The appropriation of any parcel of land, by improving it, does not harm anyone else, since there was still enough and as good left. This was especially true during the long period of settlement in the Midwestern states of the United States. A settler in Kansas who enclosed and improved 100 acres of land could be thought of as identical to the itinerant immigrant in Massachusetts, who has yet to take any land at all. The similarity is that both have left as much for others who might come along and want to make use of the land. Locke uses the analogy of land to water in a river to prove his point. Paragraph 33, Second Treatise. Quote, nobody could think himself injured by the drinking of another man, though he took a good draught, who had a whole river of the same water left him to quench his thirst. In other words, if we both come up to a large running river, and you dip into it and drink out of it, you're not taking anything away from me. There's plenty of water in that river. There are restrictions, though, in the possession of land, identical to the natural law limitations that govern the appropriation of fruits and game. Locke's use of the phrase, as much as one can use the product of, equally applies to both. If a farmer enclosed a piece of land and allowed the grass in the enclosure to rot on the ground, or, quote, the fruit of his planting perished without gathering and laying up, then this will be looked upon as waste. A land in which the product goes to waste can justifiably be taken, Locke says, by someone else. Paragraph 38, second treatise. I'm going to end now with Locke's final remarks. This will be brief, but he talks about the origin of money and how that has influenced the rise of inequality. The moral limitations placed on how much land a person can possess through his own labor substantially restricts the size of his land. This is 5.6 now of Chapter 5, the origin of money and the rise of inequality. I'll repeat that sentence. The moral limitations placed on how much land a person can possess through his own labor substantially restricts the size of his land. The restriction that has the most effect is the one we already mentioned. Only as much as one can use the product of. Locke has a solution. Adopt the practice of taking money for the product that one cannot use. Locke defines money as, quote, some lasting thing that men might keep without spoiling, and that by mutual consent men would take in exchange for the truly useful but perishable supports of life. Paragraph 47, second treatise. For example, a sparkling pebble and a large dull rock, those are both things that can be kept without spoiling. And if everyone agrees that sparkling pebbles or large dull rocks can be taken in exchange for baskets of apples, then those things will constitute money. Because the only restriction Locke puts on it is not that it's a diamond or a rock. Both are some lasting thing that you can keep without spoiling. If there is some mutual consent you have with other men, other persons, who agree with you to take them in exchange for the truly useful but perishable supports of life, for example, land or plums. Locke's contention is that the introduction of the use of money into the state of nature allows its inhabitants a justifiable way to get around the restrictions already mentioned about how much land one may possess. Quote, paragraph 50, a man may fairly possess more land than he himself can use the product of by receiving in exchange for the overplus gold and silver, which may be hoarded up without injury to anyone, these metals not spoiling or decaying in the hands of the possessor. Now, choosing gold and silver is arbitrary. It could just as well be not peanuts, but dull rocks. If I use my 1,000 acres of land to grow oranges, and the amount of oranges I grow far exceeds what I can use, then I can take money in the form of gold, silver, or sparkling pebbles, large dull rocks for the extra oranges, because these things are things that will never spoil. Therefore, my steady accumulation of money after each harvest of oranges doesn't harm anyone, and if I use a portion of my money to purchase more land on which I plant even more orange trees, then once again I do no harm to others, so long as I continue to sell the oranges to others before they spoil. Now, Locke admits that this arrangement will eventually result in a disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth. But the inequality, no matter how large, is justifiable because men have given their tacit and voluntary consent to the use of money defined above or earlier as a lasting thing taken in exchange for the perishable supports of life. Now, there is a flaw in this argument that has been pointed out by some scholars. Notice that the argument makes the false assumption that a person who consents to the use of money also consents to every bad consequence, not just the good consequence, of the use of the money. The form of Locke's argument is that person P consents to the use of A. For example, Herman or Tatia consents to the use of Herman's bicycle. And then you add another premise. The use of the bicycle has the consequence that Tatia falls off and breaks a leg. Therefore, we're supposed to assume that she consented to that consequence. That's just invalid. At the time of consent, the consequences may be unknown to the one who consents. And so we can say of people in the state of nature that the consequences of taking things in some kind of consent for it, or even the word tacit consent, which leads to the bad consequence of inequality, is not a conclusion that one can draw from Locke's argument. So we're going to leave it at that for thought and discussion. Each chapter, by the way, of my book has several questions for thought and discussion. The chapter we just finished on property has 9 questions. Any one of them, by the way, can be used for the basis of a killer term paper. I'm sure you can do that. So I'll see you next time. We're going to be doing episode 10 on paternal power and conjugal society. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.